Hey there, and welcome to today's edition of Horsesmouth Live and the Extraordinary Advisor Show. My name is Ellen Rogan, and as always, I bring in really interesting, really expert guests to share information to help you in every area of your life, especially your business. I am so excited about our topic today. We have an innovation creativity expert, Amy Climer, who's going to be talking to us about how to bring more creativity into your business. And I'll give you Amy's official bio in just a second, but I'm so fascinated about this because I think as advisors, there's a tendency to think like, hey, I'm a numbers person. I'm not creative. And yet, A, I bet you are. And B, it's so super important that you look at creativity and innovation in your practice to not only make it more fun and interesting, but actually more relevant for your clients. So before I dig in with Amy and ask her so many questions that I have, let me give you a little bit about her background. Dr. Amy Climer teaches organizations and teams how to increase their creativity so that they can maximize innovation. She works with forward-thinking companies and big ones and small ones, but big ones like the Mayo Clinic, Stanford University, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. She's the host of the Deliberate Creative podcast, where she shares practical advice and strategies to help leaders build innovative teams. I also know that Amy's out there doing all sorts of educational programs for regular people that maybe aren't a huge corporation to help them be more creative, more effective, lead more creative meetings as well. So Amy, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Ellen. It's so great to be here.
Yeah, so what do you tell people that say like, oh, no, I'm really not that creative? And, like I'm a numbers person, right? This is really what I do. I'm really more left brain. What would you say to someone that would say that to you?
Well, first, I would say we all have creative potential. In fact, we're all born with this high amount of creativity. But sometimes what happens is through life, particularly through school, that kind of gets squished out of us a little bit. And part of being creative is really just learning how. It's a skill. It's a skill that you can develop and learn just like any other skill, just like being an accountant or CPA, or just like being a financial person. Like you can learn this skill just like any other. You can learn how to be creative just like any other skill. In fact, the other thing about creativity you should know is that it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you keep telling yourself that you're not creative, you're not going to be that creative. And if you can shift your language and start thinking of yourself as more creative, well, then you'll be more creative.
That's interesting because I remember thinking back when I first started as a financial advisor, I did say that, like, oh, I'm not so creative. My dad and brother are artists and architects. They're creative. My mom painted. She's creative. And then once I stopped actually labeling myself that way, I realized all the ways that I was adding creativity to the work that I do. Right from the start of my practice, I was doing a lot of public speaking, and clearly that's creative to create a talk that resonates with people. But why does it really even matter? I mean, someone might say like, that's fine. I'm not going to do my own logo, and I am in a numbers profession. So why does being creative matter for my business?
Well, I think let me back up one step and just point out what creativity is not, and that it is not about being artistic. It's not about your ability to draw. You can like make this horrible logo for yourself that you would never want to show anybody, yet still be a highly creative person. So that's important to know first. The other thing about creativity, I guess the definition that I use is that creativity is novelty that is valuable. So if you think about it that way, creativity is really about solving problems. And so even if you are a numbers person, your primary job is to solve problems for your clients. And this isn't about like creative accounting, like in the negative sense. And we think about, Enron or something. That's not what we're talking about here. But really in how do you do your work, your practice, and how do you interact with clients? And, obviously we've had massive change in the world in the last year. And you've probably seen some people who have been able and willing to like, oh, okay, let me respond to this in a creative way. And consequently, they're just like rocking it. They're soaring. And then there are other people who I've definitely seen who just like, oh no, I'm not changing anything. And they're struggling, and their businesses are struggling because they weren't willing to be creative and innovate. And so I think it's super important to do it and to be creative in order to be able to thrive and to better serve your clients.
Uh, So is creativity and innovation the same thing, or are they cousins? Like, how do they relate to each other?
I will admit I use the words interchangeably a fair bit. I think of creativity as, well, like I said before, it's novelty with value. Innovation, sometimes we use that word when we think about economic gain related to the creativity. So for instance, we might say like Steve Jobs was highly creative, or we would say Steve Jobs is innovative, but then we might say Pablo Picasso or Georgia O'Keeffe was creative. The reality is like they're both following a fairly similar process, and they're both creating amazing new things. But Steve Jobs was with Apple, like, doing this in a way where he's making a lot of money. Whereas artists, often that's not the primary thing they think about. I find that sometimes it's just semantics. But I do think that creativity is about implementation. And sometimes people say, oh, well, creativity is just about generating the ideas and innovation is about the implementation. And actually what the research literature says is that's not the case. There's a creative process that I teach, and the last stage of that process is implementation, because that's a big part of learning. Like, does this actually work? What do we need to change? How do we need to adjust? And so if you're not implementing, ideas are free. They're not even a dime a dozen. They're just like running around for free. So it is about implementation, but I don't get too caught up in the semantics of the words creativity versus innovation.
So how do you recommend that people become more innovative in their businesses? And how do they start to do that if it's something they haven't thought of themselves as very good at in the past?
Yeah. I think that, first of all, a big part of creativity, of course, is coming up with ideas. But even before that, it's really identifying, well, what are you trying to accomplish? Like, what problem are you trying to solve? So are you trying to get new clients? Are you trying to serve your existing clients in more expansive ways? And so starting off with identifying what's the problem you want to focus on. So you pick a problem, and in the creative problem solving process, which is a process I teach, we call that clarify. So you're going to clarify whatever that problem is. Then you start generating ideas on how you might solve that problem. And when I say generating ideas, I don't mean like 4 or 5 ideas that you write out on a Post-it note. I'm talking about dozens, maybe hundreds of ideas, depending on how big the problem is. So this might be sitting down and basically just like strapping yourself to a chair for 30 minutes and be like, all right, I'm going to come up with some ideas and see how many you can get. And you can pull these ideas from as many sources as you want. You can get inspiration anywhere you want. But try to go a little wild and crazy with those ideas, right? Now, some of those ideas will be trash. You're like, yeah, I'm not doing that. That's totally fine. But the reason we generate a lot of ideas is that you can then, like, ideas lead to more ideas, and quantity leads to quality. So maybe you generate 50 ideas and only 5 of them are even worth pursuing, but chances are they weren't the first 5 ideas you came up with, which is why you want to go for some quantity there. So you take those best ideas and then you develop them a little bit further, because initially, the idea is like, it'll fit on a Post-it note, right? It's just a sentence or two. It's nothing. And so you have to develop it a little bit further and explore, like, okay, well, if I were to do this, what might it look like? And what are the pros and cons of this? Or how much would it cost? How much time, all those factors you want to think about before you jump in. And then finally, jump in, implement, and try it out. And maybe try it out on a small scale. So instead of doing this with every client you have, try it with 3 or 4, see what happens. So that's the process that you might go through to get more creative and to generate some new ideas.
And how, if there's an advisor who's got a team working with them, maybe it's a team of just 1 or 2 people, maybe it's a bigger team, how would you enroll your team in this creative process?
So I think, involving them along the entire process is awesome if you're able to, and if they're willing. And so having, the team get together and talk about, well, what is the problem, or what do we want to solve? Have the team get together and generate ideas, developing those ideas. Some people without going too much on a side topic here, but some people have more of a propensity towards clarifying. Some people love ideating. Some people develop, so forth. And so if you have team members with diverse personalities and strengths, that's awesome. Bringing them in is really good to getting them part of the whole process. And so there's some things to think about to make that team more creative. Should we go there, Ellen?
Yeah, and I just don't want to forget to mention this. The part of the reason that I asked about teams was because I just watched your TED Talk, which was so great. So all of you out there should just Google Amy Climer TED Talk, and then I'm sure you'll find it. It's on creativity with teams. So yeah, go into that a little bit. I think that's helpful because the other thing that I learned from watching your TED Talk, your team may be your team in your office, but it also may be your family could be a team that you're working with.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in my TED Talk, I shared some research that I did as part of my PhD dissertation. And I identified that there are 3 elements that teams need if they want to be creative together. And I'm going to hold up this little drawing. Let's see if this will work. All right. So there's these 3 elements. So teams need to have a clear team purpose. They need to have strong team dynamics. And they need to know and use a creative process. And so the creative process that I just mentioned, those 4 stages of clarify, ideate, develop, implement, that's the creative process that I'm talking about right here. Now, the challenge is that most people don't know that process or understand it. And so they don't even realize there is a process for creativity. So that's the first thing. But having your team have a conversation about what is our purpose? Like, what are we actually doing? Why do we meet on a regular basis? And you can have that conversation in your family, actually. And then the team needs to have strong dynamics with each other, meaning they need to trust each other, they need to be able to communicate well, and they need to be able to engage in conflict. And so if your team avoids conflict at all costs, that actually is going to decrease your creativity. But on the flip side, if you're always in conflict, that's also going to decrease your creativity. So you want to be able to disagree about the ideas and concepts that you're focused on. Otherwise, you risk getting into groupthink and everyone just going along with an idea just because they don't want to rock the boat, which is not healthy for creativity.
So what are some other ways that, now we're back to the individual thing, talking about his or her creativity, what are some ways that people put up blocks for themselves or that are barriers for being as creative as you could be?
I think one of the biggest barriers is the fact that being creative is a risk. And you have to be able and willing to take a risk in order to be creative. And sometimes that could be a financial risk. More often, though, it's people are worried about what other people are going to think or how they're going to be viewed. And if you can get past that and you can be more open and be willing to experiment, that's going to be huge in helping you be more creative. And what I've found just in my own consulting practice is that when I do that, when I put myself out there, then my clients love it. They actually really appreciate it. And I think they see some humanity there, but also I think maybe it's inspirational and it's exciting to see. So if you're worried how your clients might think, what they might think about what you're experimenting, what you're doing, tell them hey, this is an experiment. I'm just trying this and I'm going to see what happens. And right there, just saying that, you're going to get a lot of leeway. And you might be surprised. So yeah, I think if you can drop some of those barriers, that's really helpful.
Can you give us an example, Amy, of how you've done it or how you've seen some of your clients incorporate creativity in their businesses?
Yeah, definitely this past year, there have been many examples. I've tried some new things this past year fortunately, with some good success. Not everything I tried worked, but one of the things I tried, I'm going to show you these cards I made. So a number of years ago, I made this deck of cards. They're called Climer cards. And it's a tool for facilitators. And what it looks like is there's all these little drawings that I made, these little cards. And one of the ways you can use them for ideation is you literally just look at the cards and you think, okay, what ideas do I get from these images? Well, one of the things that I did this year in my business is I took this whole concept and I converted it into a SaaS product, a software as a service, basically a web app. And I launched that in November, had no idea how it would go. I mean, obviously I thought it would go well. I hired a software company, I invested in it, and it's been super fun. And I've gotten some great feedback. I probably have about 450 facilitators using it now. We're maybe 5 months into it, 4 months into it. So that was something that I experimented with, and I had done some prototyping. So I didn't just dive in and hire this software company out of the blue. I tested it first with a small group of people to see okay, could this work? And then when I got some positive feedback, I'm all right, let's go the next step. And so I'm kind of doing this incrementally so that I'm keeping the risk relatively low for myself. But that's an example of something that I was able to do and apply some creativity.
So talk to us a little bit more about that the SaaS product, whatever you called it, but the Climer cards that are online. Because you had mentioned to me once that there's an advisor that's talking about using this with her clients. So how are either the facilitators or this advisor saying this might be something that would be an interesting tool to use? Explain that a little bit more, Amy.
Yeah, of course. So the product is called Virtual Climer Cards, based on the original product, which was Climer Cards. And the way it works is, in the virtual context, there's all the cards are up on the screen. And so the cards look like this, and they're all up on the screen. And you ask a question and you ask your client to pick a card based on that question. So for an example, say you're working with a new client, it's your first day and you're kind of trying to figure out what their goals are for their financial situation. You might ask them, pick a card that represents your financial goals. And, they might pick the heart, and it doesn't actually matter what they pick, but whatever they pick, they'll then respond. And what's interesting is that people say more and they say different things with the cards than they would have if you had just asked them the question. So maybe you ask them that question first, and then you say, okay, pick another card that represents where you think you are now. And, maybe they pick the boot and they have something to say well, I feel like I've got a long way to go. Or maybe they pick the cactus and they feel like, things feel pretty rough and prickly right now, and here's why. And again, it's just interesting to see what people say. And there's been some, I would say it's interesting way to have a conversation. It's a little bit more creative. People tend to open up a little bit more than if you just ask the questions without the cards.
Yeah, and I know you have, because I saw on social media you had a whole bunch of cards just delivered, pallets of cards. So advisors could actually get the cards. And here's what I love about that for people to think of in the creativity is that the financial services industry is getting even more and more commoditized. And advisors can cling on to their, I'm an expert on X, Y, and Z. But my experience is if you give your clients or potential clients actually a different experience, they're more likely to see you as different than the other advisor or want to stay with you. And the other thing I like about using some creativity in those conversations is there's a tendency, especially for CFPs, for certified financial planners, to go through the checklist. Okay, these are clients' goals. What age do you want to retire? Where do you want to send your kids to college? And X, Y, and Z. And it's almost as if the goals are given to your clients by you versus the way it should be, which is they tell you what their goals are. So to have something to allow them to access, I don't know if it's, Amy, you would be able to talk about this, if it's accessing a different part of their brain or using creativity and starting to think about their goals in a different way, I would see is so additive. I mean, is it getting your client to think in a way that's different than if you were just having a conversation or running through the numbers with them?
I absolutely, I 100% agree. And just from a very personal perspective, about 2 years ago, maybe, my wife and I went through the process of finding a new financial planner. We had moved states and our other person no longer worked in the state we're in. And so we met with three different people. And the person that we went to first of all, I feel like they really listened to our goals. And they were very interested in what they were. They weren't trying to change them or adjust them. And they also, I felt like they had a little bit more of an open, creative approach in how they ran the conversation versus like, oh, what age you want to retire? What age are you going to die? Which is always like the weirdest question, right? um, so I think, like, who knows that, right? But every financial planner has to ask that. And I get why, right? But it's just funny. Yeah, so I think like using the cards, it does open up a different part of your brain. And the cards are basically the part of they're basically metaphors. You're setting these options for the client to create metaphors, and I don't know what part of the brain that is, but yeah, it's definitely tapping into perhaps like I guess more of a creative, like abstract part of the brain. And yeah, like I said, it's just interesting that clients will say different things than they would have without the cards. And ultimately, I think that's what you want as a financial planner is you're trying to get clients to open up and figure out like, all right, how can I help them? How can I connect with them? I think that's a big part of being a financial planner.
Do you, along with the cards, are there questions that you give to say, or these are questions you can use with these cards, like prompt
There's
questions?
some, like when you buy them, you get some questions that are in the deck. There's also a free ebook that I have on my website at climercards.com where you can download, and there's all sorts of questions in there. There's some activities. And actually, just today, like a couple hours ago, I started a brand new Facebook group of a Climer Cards user community. And the intention there is for people who are using them to just be able to share, like, well, what questions are you asking? Where are you getting stuck or what's working really well? And so that's open to anyone who has Climer Cards. If any of you all want to get a deck, check them out, try them, play with them with your clients and show up and join the Facebook group, you're welcome to.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I'd love to, my creativity is going, oh, we should work on this and come up with some financial advisor specific questions so we can take that offline, Amy. I think that would be
Yeah, I
so
love it.
great. And because there's the team ones also, just to go back to the first thing you said, which I think is not how I went into this conversation thinking about creativity, but this idea of how do you solve problems for yourself and your team. And I don't know, there's so much stress that's happening in the world now with our clients, with money, maybe with you. The market's been pretty good, but then like if you're reading any of the financial things, there's some people that are like, oh my God, it's going to implode. And other people like, no, it's going to be amazing. And the bottom line is we don't know. And that uncertainty causes stress. But my experience in my business over all these years is that when I can just get calm enough to get past seeing the problem right in front of my face, I do come up with creative solutions. And having a tool to help with that is so incredibly important. What else do you want to share with us in terms of if there's a few tips to just up your creativity and maybe grow that creativity bicep muscle? What would it be that you would suggest for people?
Well, actually, you just said something that I think is quite significant, and that there's this inverse relationship. How do I describe that? But anyway, that as stress goes up, creativity goes down. And so one of the ways to increase your creativity is decrease your stress. And that might just be temporarily, like, okay, for 1 hour, I'm not going to think about my problems and I'm just going to, focus on being creative. So it could be a temporary decrease. And it was interesting, like right when the pandemic hit, March 2020, at least in the US, I just stopped talking about creativity because like people didn't want to hear it. They were way too stressed. And they had all these other things to think about, like, am I going to die from COVID? Or am I going to like have a job next week? Like huge, highly stressful situations, right? Totally get it. So, but then as people kind of settled in and like maybe around June and July, then there was more interest and conversation around creativity. And that was just interesting to watch from a global level. And so I think just at a very personal level is to think about, okay, how can I decrease my stress, even if it's just temporary, in order to be more creative? And so whether that's doing some breathing or meditating for I mean, 2-3 minutes might be enough. And then getting into some creativity practices like generating ideas, maybe using the cards or using some other tools. There's a lot of other options. I have a podcast, which you mentioned at the beginning, called The Deliberate Creative. And there's a free workbook that I've created that goes along with episodes, I think it's 3-7. Yeah, it's up on the screen right now. And if you download that workbook, you'll find a bunch of activities that you can do that can just help generate your creativity. And so feel free to download that if you're interested.
Yeah, which I did, and it's really great. It's easy to follow, and it had me thinking about things in a different way, and I could see using that with myself, and then also with my team. And you spoke music that sings to my ears about meditating, because our audience who's listened to me before knows that I'm a cheerleader for the benefits of quieting that like snow globe of thoughts. And that
Totally.
really saved me probably, I don't know, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars, but certainly tens of thousands of dollars in my practice when there was issues that came up that at first seemed unsolvable. And then because I got quiet enough and just trusted the answer would come, that it did. And I didn't have to move it a little more quickly. I didn't have your process. I wish I did, or I will now. But that's really, really great advice. And so for all of you out there, please go ahead and download that free tool from Amy. Yeah, thank you, Doug, for putting that back up on the screen. And Amy, this is so great. Let's do this again. It's so nice to see you. I was saying earlier to Doug before we got started that you are in a year only the second person I didn't know in person that I got to meet in person when I was in Asheville in a whole year.
Nice.
Because of weird networking and social distancing. So we went for a very safe social distant walk in Asheville, and it was so great. So I'm thrilled to have you in my circle now, Amy, and so grateful that you were able to provide all this terrific information to our guests here today. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me, Ellen. It was a pleasure. I just get so jazzed when I get to talk about creativity. And I'm excited that maybe some financial planners out there will be a little bit more creative now.
Yeah, me too. And thank you for all of you listening to this. I'm so grateful that you're here. If you want more information on me, you can go to ellenrogan.com. And I do have a special report, What Clients Crave, if you go to ellenrogan.com/Horsesmouth. And there's also some mindfulness resources on there because I always bake those in. It's like zucchini in the cookies. We always want you to have those resources. And please stay in touch. Let me know. You can find me on all the social media at ellenrogan.com. Let me know what resonates with you. If you have guest suggestions, if you want to have more information on some things, then I'd be thrilled to hear from you. And the question to ponder today is, how creative are you willing to be? Remember to be great and create great every single day.